The CDC recently released this long COVID prevalence study in adults, which was in their Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, focusing on the long COVID prevalence in states in 2022, where in 2022, by their estimates, 6.9% of US adults reported experiencing long COVID. And we know for a fact that this is a drastic undercount and underestimate, because it's only looking at adults aged 18 years or older. And we know that COVID happens in the pediatric population, people that are 17 years and under. The data is collected through a population-based cross-sectional survey, which is conducted by randomly dialing phone numbers of both landlines and cell phones, where people are self-reporting age, previous COVID diagnosis, and if they had long COVID or not, which was done through a survey. And long COVID here was defined as a self-report of any symptoms lasting 3 months or longer. And these had to be not present before having long COVID, and that's sort of a misnomer, a bad assumption, because we know that for some people it will actually exacerbate other symptoms, like if you have pre-existing asthma, it can make this significantly worse, and that would be a symptom of long COVID, or at the very least, a long COVID, post-COVID complication, where this is their major breakdown right here. This is the meat and potatoes of the report. So I'm not great at geography, so I need the Wikipedia map to help, where I decided to break these down into tiers, where it's tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So when I group all the states that were reported there in the colors within each tier, this is what it looks like, and it actually creates a fun little histogram, where tier 1 would be the worst category, tier 4 would be the not as bad but still bad category, and I would label their tier 5 category as unreliable, because these are territories of the US, and there are major gaps in the territories for long COVID surveillance. So while I am showing a tier 5, truly it's just a tier 1 to 4. So why is this an undercount? Well, they're not using direct population data. They're randomly calling people all throughout the United States, and this is only data collected from people that, one, answered their phone, filled out the survey, and walked through all the questions. So there's a lot of different barriers that kind of like self-select down to this, where again, it's focusing just on adults, it's excluding kids that have long COVID. And we also know that people with long COVID, a lot of them have things like post-exertional malaise, which would make them be less likely to even answer a very long and an in-depth random survey that they just get a random phone call from an unknown number from. And based off of the UK reports, we know that as you have an increase in the number of infections, this percentage likelihood of getting long COVID increases, so we're going to continue to expect the incidence of long COVID to increase in our population over time. Now, what's really interesting is I tied in US policies, the stay-at-home orders, as well as school closures in 2020-2021 to see what impact this could have had on the 2022 data. Because the more people that are getting COVID in a state, the higher likelihood that those people would be developing long COVID. So I went through and pulled out the states that did not have a stay-at-home order ever issued in their state. That's in red, and then the ones with the longest period of time, the longest stay-at-home orders in the states, and I grouped them down here. And I did a similar thing with school closure duration, group them down here. And then we can tie in the long COVID prevalence ranking through the tier system with ones that had very weak stay-at-home or no stay-at-home issued versus those that had the longest stay-at-home, as well as the shortest school closures and the longest school closures. So for states that had no stay-at-home order, their severity ranking was about 2.3, while the ones that had the longest stay-at-home orders issued, their severity ranking was at about 3.3, which is essentially a 2% difference, so going from about a 6% prevalence to about an 8% prevalence of long COVID. So the stay-at-home orders seem to have had a pretty significant impact on the prevalence of long COVID, and there even seems to be a difference between the ones that had the shortest school closures and the longest school closures, where we have about a half-tier ranking for difference between the ones that had the shortest and the longest school closures, showing that having effective policies has a direct impact on public health. Look at that data. I compiled it here in my link tree. Just go down to the state policies and potential impacts of long COVID. You can download the data here. Here's a map through Wikipedia, and then this is the MMWR report on long COVID.